So first of all, I speak why we're together. And Brandon's story is really inspiring because he created one of the things that really makes not only gaming a little better, but also multiple other industries. Brandon, would you mind to introduce yourself?
Sure.
And how will we sharing?
Sure. Hi there. I'm Brendan Burns. Thanks for coming out. Hopefully it's interesting and useful. I don't normally talk to the gaming crowd necessarily. I talk to a lot of game customers, a lot of customers in general. But here's a really unique opportunity. I actually have a pretty deep personal history in gaming. I almost wore my Infocom shirt. So I started gaming at a very young age on a Commodore 64. Through text adventures, through Ultima, if anybody played Ultima, like that was middle school. Ultima was middle school. And I graduated to Wolfenstein 3D. And then all the way through, I had a Mac actually. So if there's any of the Bungie people in the house, I was a marathon person. Yeah. All right. There we go. And I've just sort of been playing throughout my time, and it's been great to actually see my kids get into it as well. So I will say, as a consumer of what you produce, I'm grateful. And then what happened to me 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to be one of the co-founders of the Kubernetes open source project while I was at Google. It's been great to see gaming embrace containerization, and Kubernetes. In the time period since then, I switched over to Microsoft. I'm at Microsoft Azure now, where I run cloud-native open source on Azure, as well as a lot of our management and DevOps portfolio. So if you've ever interacted with Azure, if you've ever interacted with Kubernetes on Azure, that's all stuff that my engineering teams built. And so I'd love to hear about that afterwards. But today, I think we're going to talk not so much about Azure, but talk in general about open source and how gaming works. And opportunities for improvement. So I'll hand it back over so you can ask one question.
Cool. It's the simple one, just like icebreaker. What do you play right now? Do you play any games?
I am this close to gold level on Call of Duty. So if anybody's a winner out there, lots of help me get over the phone. I've been enjoying that. I've been playing the new Indiana Jones, which I'm also mad about. I've been enjoying that as well. That's really good. It's nice because I'm actually much more. I mentioned Call of Duty. I'm much more of a narrative game player than a multiplayer thing. I've been enjoying Call of Duty, but I've been enjoying going through the story and actually enjoying the fact that my wife is really into Indiana Jones, but not as into games, is actually willing to sit and watch me play the Indiana Jones game because she likes the story. So that's cool too. So,
but that times is more difficult. So what do you see the role of open source in the gaming and how it can really help game studios to strive and make better games?
Sure. I think when I think about open source, and especially vendor neutral open source, one of the real amazing things that it can do is bring together competitors to focus on undifferentiated heavy lifting. But because we have this open source community and it's independently governed and it's independently in foundation with the Linux Foundation, it means that a bunch of people who otherwise are pretty tight competitors can come together to focus on code that is important and useful, but isn't necessarily something that you want to monetize directly. It's not intellectual property that you want to hold up close to yourself. And I think that there's a reason why open source and cloud and distributed systems have kind of grown in collaboration. And I think gaming is increasingly becoming a distributed system. And it's because there's just tons of complexity, right? It is too hard to build a reliable multiplayer game today. And it's too hard to build a reliable distributed system in general. And so I think the role of open source is to say, okay, let's all come together and let's build the stuff that we all need that we're not going to differentiate on. Like, you don't have to build, I don't know. I apologize to people who believe that their matchmaking system is the secret sauce that makes their game the differentiated thing that it is. But matchmaking or leaderboards or any chat, chat is an essential part of gaming, but the system that delivers chat, you don't need to rewrite that every single time you build a game. And you don't need to have your studio build one and someone else's studio build one and all of that. If you can all come together around a single solution, that's really the value proposition that open source makes available to you. And that's the reason we're seeing it grow in cloud. And I think also that's the reason why it has a lot of value for, and that's the reason why there's a lot of value for gaming. And I think the thing is that gaming has sort of seen this before in a little bit of a more proprietary format, I guess. I'm old enough that I remember when every game came with its own renderer, right? And now there's a handful of game engines that everybody uses. And that's because everybody's recognized that, like, that's not the core value proposition. And I would encourage everybody to think about, what are the places where we can come together in a vendor-neutral way to do that undifferentiated heavy lifting together. And we've seen that in the cloud, and I think it can be delivered for a lot of different areas, a lot of different verticals.
So, and actually, when we, everyone knows what distributed systems are, yeah? Everyone knows. Okay, awesome. So, and when we think about distributed systems, so what are kind of the unaddressed problems that gaming companies are facing right now?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest problem that I see, and you guys are the experts, so you should correct me if I'm wrong. But the biggest problem that I really see is that gaming today is in many cases, especially the game itself, is defined by the size of the largest instance that you can get in the cloud. The number of players that can participate in a battle royale is the number of players that will fit on the largest VM that you can buy from Azure, or the largest VM that you can buy from AWS. And that's a problem, right? Because that means there's an inherent limit in most cases to the number of people you can bring into your communities, the number of people you can bring into your world. And as a cloud provider, I hear all the hate mail when that game server goes down. And so the inherent sort of needs for reliability to deliver a great gaming experience, because it's on a single machine, because it's a single server, that's a problem as well. And so I think that, thinking about how do you move from a game server that runs on a single machine to a truly resilient system that you could run an upgrade across and nobody noticed. You could patch a bug and your gamers keep playing. And you can have failures happen, and again, nobody notices what goes on. You can scale beyond a single system, a single region. Those are all problems that we've sorted out in a variety of other distributed systems. I think those are really relevant things. And then, of course, I think there's also more specific problems for gaming around user embedded content. We're doing a lot of interesting stuff in cloud infrastructure around how you can bring untrusted code into trusted environments and run it successfully. I think it's a great example of something that, as we see more and more user content come into games like Fortnite and beyond, that's going to be an essential part as well. And again, I think all of these things are not the things that are going to differentiate games. They're going to be requirements. And so the degree to which you can build them out in the open, build them together, it will enable just better games for everybody. And I think that's a real benefit.
And actually, when we speak, you mentioned talk about also the latency part. So latency is important because game companies would like to go as close as possible to the customer, and then they realize they need to manage a lot of resources, and the resources could be very expensive or could be complicated to figure out what to do with that, especially with the cloud stuff. So what do you think about this issue, and any advice would you get from your perspective into the gaming studios and gaming tech executives?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things actually about gaming as a workload for cloud is it's one of the most aggressively multi-cloud workloads that we see, right? Because everybody wants their game servers to be as close as possible to the end user. And that means if Azure is the best in Korea, you'll go use Azure. If AWS is the best in China, well, actually, maybe not, but in a different region, you will go and use them in that region. And that means you need to be able to manage your infrastructure across a bunch of clouds. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of value from open source solutions like Kubernetes and containers, because you can have a consistent experience across all of those clouds. Your developers don't have to worry about the details of how do I deploy to Azure, how do I deploy to AWS, how do I deploy to maybe on-premise servers. If you containerize and you use Kubernetes, you can have the exact same fabric everywhere and then deliver the latency that you need for the developer by going to the place that's closest to them. And so that's definitely a value proposition of these vendor-neutral interfaces. that we see a lot of gaming companies take for.
Good job. Initially, it's really cool. So when we think about the emergent tech in cloud right now, so kind of emergent trends, cloud gaming technology executives need to look right now in order to make their games better, faster, and more reliable.
Sure. Well, I was just talking with the Fastly crew about WebAssembly. I think if you haven't, gaming is one of these places where having fast, loadable content to plug into your game is a big part of that. And WebAssembly is really a great polyglot technology for inserting user-generated or other scripted content into the games. I think that's a huge thing. We're doing a big investment in WebAssembly, actually, and using it on the server. I think the other interesting thing that we're focused on a lot is how do you bring AI into these environments and do it in a way that isn't necessarily tied to any specific vendor. And again, I think that's the open source part of it, where when we look at AI, there's a lot of great vendor-specific models like OpenAI on Azure, but there's also a lot of open source models out there, and we want people to be able to take advantage of bringing that in alongside their game. I'm actually surprised that generative AI hasn't had more of an impact on gaming so far. It feels like a pretty natural fit when I see some of the kind of pretty unnatural dialogue that I encounter from NPCs around the world. It feels like a pretty natural fit for a lot of the content generation that needs to happen. And so I would definitely encourage people to go check that out, see what it's good for. I think there's a lot of opportunity with generative.
Awesome. It's really cool. So you mentioned about AI, and I think every of you in some capacity talk internally or externally about that. And what do you think, what about the impact of, not the impact of AI into gaming, but more about, do you see that AI will come closer to the users? In the end, there will be more on device, and what are the possible implications it can bring to games?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff around bringing AI down into the devices for personalization. I think obviously one of the challenges that we're working through with a lot of the AI that we're doing is how do you protect privacy, and how do you make sure that you can keep your data in a particular location. And so I think a lot of AI comes down to the device or to a nearby device, right? I think it's not clear that augmented reality glasses or a mobile phone will have the computing power that's necessary, but maybe taking advantage of a nearby GPU and having that ability to have portability of workloads and artificial intelligence inference across a bunch of different devices is going to be pretty critical, I think, to delivering these solutions. We can't have everybody always going back to the cloud for every single thing that they need to do for AI. Obviously, the really high intensity models, those are going to be in the cloud. And also there's, real concerns around protecting intellectual property. And that's also going to necessitate keeping some of these models up in the cloud. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on figuring out how do you have a hybrid of local AI and in the cloud AI.
First of all, when we talk about games a lot, and we talk that making games is a very expensive journey. Especially when you do games like AAA games, new seasons that can cost millions of dollars, in some cases tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. We've heard some new season can cost up to like $1 billion to make, which is extremely expensive. The question is as follows: so how can we make games cheaper? So where are we going in the direction, and how we make studios more efficient from that perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good analogy here from the world of AI, right? And not AI for content generation, although I think that's an interesting direction to go, but rather when you look at today's AI, they didn't have to start by figuring out how do I get 1,000 machines to work together and schedule my jobs and do all this stuff. They just said, hey, let's install Kubernetes on all those machines. And suddenly we get to schedule our workloads everywhere. And so there is this notion that you have to build, in order to do things cheaply, or at least quickly, you have to build abstractions that you can rely on and that everybody can rely on. And it takes a little bit of a leap of faith, right? Because I think when we started doing the Kubernetes project, we had to convince our executives that open sourcing it was a good idea, right? Because they thought, oh, well, we have this, we have this secret information, or we have this intellectual property and we don't want to share it with our competitors. And what if they take it and advance the industry and we lose out? And a lot of what we had to do was say, like, look, the whole industry benefits if you raise the level of abstraction, and will benefit. And yes, you have to share some of that benefit as well, but everybody benefits from having better cloud infrastructure. And I think you can also make the argument that everybody benefits from it being easier and cheaper to build games. And I think, so that's part of getting people over that leap of faith of saying, like, it's okay for all of the studios to have the same chat system. It's okay for all the studios to collaborate together in an open source project. It's not something that I think comes naturally maybe to everyone who's in a leadership position in some of these competitive environments. But that's a case that needs to be made. And then the byproduct of that becomes like, well, what is the thing you actually care about? The thing you care about is your narrative. The thing you care about is your content. The thing you care about is your gameplay. Obviously none of that stuff is going to go be open source. And so really focusing your energy on the things that differentiate your games and enabling community to emerge amongst the industry to build the undifferentiated stuff, build the stuff that really everybody has to have, but like, honestly, why would everybody rebuild? I think that's the real opportunity to make things faster, make things easier. I don't think you're ever going to get around like the fact that building content is going to be hard and expensive, right? Like that's what defines a great game. But there's a ton of work that I feel like everybody is reinventing every time. And this isn't, I talking about gaming, but honestly, I see this throughout the industry, right? Like if you imagine a long time ago, we just had programming languages. And then somewhere along the line, someone said, you know what? A programming language without a standard library is pretty useless, right? And so now I think you can't imagine a programming language that doesn't also have a standard library for doing a ton of other things, HTTP clients and everything else that you do. But in the cloud and in these distributed systems, we haven't gotten there. And I think, in industry verticals like gaming, we haven't gotten there. We haven't said, like, it's insufficient to just have the places where you can run your games. You have to have all of these other services that surround them, and they need to be supplied not by your company or by someone else's company, but by the broad community. I think that's the leap that you have to get to. Lots of you are running on top of Linux. I know that. You're standing on the shoulders of, at this point, 30 years-ish of people just providing their own energy and their own contributions into this abstract layer that you then use as an operating system to build on top of. And the question that I would ask is like, why do you stop there? And we didn't stop, we built up to Kubernetes. Okay, why do you stop there? Well, there's no reason to stop. You can keep moving further up the stack and say, okay, what can we do as a community? What are the foundations we might have to build together? What are the agreements we have to come to together so that we can trust each other? But it's doable, and people have done it in other places. I think we see it as a real opportunity, not just for each individual industry, but also as a place where the cloud can help contribute as well, right? One of the things that we do as Microsoft and with other cloud providers is provide homes for that open source infrastructure to run. And a sort of a trusted independent party to help enable those communities. So I think that's a big part of it.
I think, and actually, when it's because Kubernetes is a big thing. So can you maybe share like a few use cases where Kubernetes really solved problems of scalability and reliability of distributed systems?
Sure. I always like to point out. I started a long time ago. So I started writing services in the late 90s. And when I started writing services, the very first thing you had to do after you ran the command line to run the service was figure out, okay, what happens when it crashes, right? All right, you need something else. You need some other program running that restarts the program if the program crashes. And I think that, 10 years now later, after this Kubernetes has come out, that's not a problem that anybody thinks about anymore. Because if you run a container in Kubernetes and that program crashes, the system just restarts it. And the analogy that I like to give, that I gave to people for this is, my son can take a quadcopter drone and an iPad and fly it around this room. And he can't do it because he's an amazing pilot. He can do it because there is a piece of command line or of control software that is taking his intent, I want to fly it around the room, and turning it into the specific motion of those motors. And that's what Kubernetes is doing. It's taking your intent, I want to run enough game servers to serve my customers, and it's turning it into action, creating a new container, creating a replication of things, creating a service to connect them. And I think those are the kinds of undifferentiated heavy lifting that you needed to figure out in order to build systems like game servers or matchmaking or whatever else you want to do that, we take care of for you now, right? You don't have to worry about service discovery. You just reference a service that's been created in Kubernetes. You don't have to worry about autoscale. You just say, please autoscale this thing that I defined in a container image. You don't even have to think about deploying your software around the world because you push it into the Azure Container Registry and it geo-replicates it around the world for you. Okay? And so these are all examples of places where these were problems that 12 years ago somebody had to figure out how to solve. And it's not rocket science, but it was annoying. And then also I think the other piece of that is because everybody was doing it individually, because everybody was developing their own solution, there's no opportunities for economies of scale, right? So if you deploy a container, if you push a container into the Azure Container Registry today, you can turn on auto patching, and that container image is automatically patched for security vulnerabilities. If everybody's inventing their own way of packaging software, we don't have any ability to build those kinds of tools into our cloud. And so the consolidation and the standardization is great, not just because it reuses effort, but also because it enables us to build tooling for everyone that otherwise we just couldn't build without a standard. There's a reason why every plug looks the same in the United States, right? Because it'd be impossible to build electric appliances if you didn't have a standard around what the plug looks like.
And I think the last question before we come, any questions from the audience. So where do you see can be the biggest major impact or innovation from open source in gaming over the next couple of years?
I really just hope that we have the ability to make it super easy for somebody who wants to say, I want an infinitely scalable game to create that game, right? I was talking to some folks who are in a startup building a game. I've got a kid who wanted to build he's really into Undertale. I don't know if anybody plays Undertale. He's really into Undertale. He wanted to build an Undertale clone. He got started, but it's hard, right? It's really hard. And I would love it if we could get to a place where somebody with a really great idea could build a really great game without having to think about how do I span multiple machines? How do I think about matchmaking? How do I implement chat? All of these things that are necessary to make a great game, but are not sufficient, because the thing that makes a great game is the idea, not all the stuff that everybody requires within the game itself. And so, in 10 years, and I think this is true for distributed systems in general, if in 10 years we can look back and there's 10x more people who are capable of building amazing games, then I think we'll have been successful. And if not, it's still hard for everybody, even people who are experts, then I think we'll have to say, well, we did achieve what we could have achieved. And I think that's true in general for distributed systems. And I keep hoping it's going to happen. It's been a long journey to get here, but that's the opportunity.